It seems extraordinary that even today there are people who still believe that Stonehenge was built in the 1950s and part of some bizarre conspiracy by archaeologists to trick us into thinking, well, who on earth knows what? Now, undoubtedly, these people have seen photographs from the 1950s showing repairs to the site, but to make the idiotic leap to their conspiracy idea is frankly bizarre. Now, my normal response, to be honest, to anyone claiming that the most famous megalithic site in the world is less than a century old, is to have a bit of a rant, citing some of my favourite examples of artists' depictions of Stonehenge through the centuries. They could have looked at the 1915 advert for the auction where the site was bought by Cecil Chubb for a princely £6,600 to see that Stonehenge must at least have been put up by the Victorians. But the last time someone left one of these idiotic comments, I thought it would be much more interesting to make a film, this film, to include some of the history rather than prehistory, and some of the wonderful depictions of Stonehenge in art that many people have never seen. Amazingly, the earliest definitive surviving reference to Stonehenge doesn't appear until the 12th century, when Henry, Archdeacon of Huntingdon, wrote his Historia Anglorum. Written between 1129 and 1154, not only is this the earliest known reference to the site, it's the first appearance of the name Stenenges, from which all other references to the more common form Stonehenge seem to be derived. We should bear in mind that this is the earliest surviving reference. We have absolutely no idea how long the name Stonehenges existed before Henry wrote it down. It's interesting that in this work, Henry lists Stonehenge as the second of 4 marvels or wonders that can be seen in England. He wrote, "The second is at Stonehenge, where stones of remarkable size are raised up like gates, in such a way that gates seem to be placed on top of gates, and no one can work out how the stones were so skillfully lifted up to such a height, or why they were erected there." What were Henry's other wonders, I hear you cry? So in order they were, number 1, the peak caverns. Henry describes winds issuing with great violence from caverns in a mountain called the Peak, ejecting and whirling objects thrown into them. 2, Stonehenge. And 3, Cheddar Gorge, which he called Cheddar Hole. Henry describes a vast cavern that many have entered and traversed for great distances underground, crossing subterranean streams without finding an end. And number 4, rain gathering on hilltops. Henry notes that in some parts of the country, rain can be seen gathering around the tops of hills before falling on the plains below. I do find it rather lovely that of Henry's 4 wonders of England, only Stonehenge is man-made and the other 3 are all natural. A short time behind, or perhaps even overlapping Henry of Huntingdon, comes one of the most famous medieval writers of them all. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, between 1136 and 1138. Now, it seems coincidental that Henry of Huntingdon's and Geoffrey of Monmouth's works should be published so close together in time. But whilst Huntingdon recorded his observations, Geoffrey of Monmouth writes stories. He gives us the earliest known reference to Stonehenge being called the Giant's Dance, and introduces the legend connecting Merlin to Stonehenge. Geoffrey tells us that the stones of Stonehenge originally came from Africa and were carried to Mount Killaraeus in Ireland by a race of giants, and the wizard Merlin then magically transported them from Ireland to the Salisbury Plain. And then, a medieval Norman poet called Wace wrote the Roman de Brut, published in 1155, also known as the Manuscript of Brut, or the Prose Brut, or the Brut Chronicle, and are originally written in Anglo-Norman, subsequently translated into Latin, and then much later, around 1400, the first English version was published. There are many versions of the Brut Chronicle, but it's the 14th century version that is the first to illustrate the passage about how a giant helped the wizard Merlin to erect the stones, depicting what is undoubtedly a lintel. Finally, a picture of Stonehenge. Another manuscript called the Scala Mundi, or Ladder of the World, was produced in various forms, also telling the story of how Merlin erected the stones and clearly showing lintels. Another version of the Scala Mundi from the 1440s illustrates the stones with accompanying text saying, Hoc anno coria gigantum de Hibernia, non vi set arte Merlini juecta apud Stonehenges. That translates as the year the giants' dance of Ireland, not by force but by the art of Merlin, was conveyed to Stonehenge. Next comes a significant development in the story. In 1575, the Flemish painter Lucas de Heere visited England during a time of political unrest at home in the Netherlands, and it was de Heere who gave us the earliest known realistic representation of the stones. In the 1610s and 1620s, the famous architect Inigo Jones was commissioned to survey the Stonehenge by none other than King James I. Inigo Jones was convinced that it was a Roman temple and made his own imagined improvements to bring it more in line with the symmetry he believed it should have had. It may be worth mentioning that although Jones drew this for the king in the early 1600s, it wasn't actually published until after his death. Inigo died in 1652, and the book entitled Stonehenge Restored first appeared in 1655. Which brings us to the renowned antiquarian William Camden. Now, Camden's major work, Britanniae, was first published in Latin in 1586, with the first English translation appearing in 1610. And in his section about Wiltshire, he wrote, For within the circuit of a ditch there are erected in manner of a crown, in 3 ranks or courses, one within another, certain mighty and unwrought stones, whereof some are 28 foot high and 7 foot broad, upon the heads of which others like overthwart pieces do bear, and rest crosswise, with a small tenons and mortices, so as the whole frame seemeth to hang, whereof we call it Stonehenge, like as our old historians termed it for the greatness Coria Gigantum, the giant's dance. From an artistic point of view, Camden's depiction of Stonehenge is fairly fanciful. The rolling hills in the background, complete with imagined castle, were copied and repeated over and over by artists who had most likely never visited the region, like this engraving by another Dutch artist called Jan Blauw in 1645. Another giant in the history of antiquarianism was John Aubrey, after whom the Aubrey holes at Stonehenge are named, and this is one of his drawings from 1666. Aubrey believed that not just Stonehenge, but all the Wiltshire megaliths were rooted in Druid culture. And half a century later, along comes William Stukeley, perhaps the most prolific and Druid-obsessed antiquarian of them all. Stukeley took Aubrey's idea and became utterly obsessed with the idea that Stonehenge was a Druid temple. He drew the stones many times throughout his life, most prolifically in the 1720s, and usually with his unique style of huge stones and tiny people. And basically from this point onwards, something happened in popular culture, and Stonehenge seems to have shifted beyond the realm of antiquarianism and gained a much deeper place in the imaginations of artists. Realistic depictions like this one from Thomas Hearne's 1779 Antiquities of Great Britain, or more imaginative pieces like poet and artist William Blake's painting from his version of the creation myth in the Book of Los. This seems to be a kind of homage to William Stukeley's, where Blake has replaced the central feature of the Avebury serpent with Stonehenge featuring unmistakably in the background. While we're talking about William Blake, he was commissioned by the ancient Druids' Universal Brethren to design this medal. Blake had not seen Stonehenge, and as in the previous painting, his idea of it came from drawings by Stukeley. The medal was produced to raise funds to help Thomas Muir, one of the martyrs of the Druid movement. Muir and several others were transported to Australia for sedition at the end of the 18th century. Another striking painting is by Charles Hamilton Smith in 1815. This aquatint image is from Costume of the Original Inhabitants of the British Islands and shows an imaginary festival of ancient Britons at Stonehenge, most probably inspired by earlier Druidic stories, as the image is, once again, complete with a version of William Stukeley's Aubrey serpent. It would take forever to go through the growing numbers of paintings and engravings being created in an increasingly romantic art world, but we should at least mention a couple of greats from the first half of the 19th century. Turner came to Stonehenge in or around 1825. John Constable followed in 1835. And to end, a personal favourite of mine because of its unabashed drama, The Druid's Sacrifice. A mezzotint created in 1832 by William Overend Geller. I could go on and on and on, but I won't. Even amongst the 16th century publications, this is far from an exhaustive list, and it will forever remain a mystery what people called or thought about Stonehenge before Henry, Archdeacon of Huntingdon, left us the first reference. So I hope I've managed to show you a few images you haven't seen before. Thanks very much for watching, and please do hit like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this, and see you again soon.